Okay, well, John has very clearly and comprehensively outlined there what has been the continuous teaching of the church from the very beginning. Mentioned how was compromised slightly with Familiaris Consortio, but even in that document, John Paul II still stresses that the role of primary educators, of parents as primary educators, is irreplaceable and inalienable, and therefore incapable of being entirely delegated to others or usurped by others. And with Amoris Laetitiae, Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation, as well as comments he's made elsewhere, Pope Francis has largely embraced the assumption of the New World Order that actually it's institutions that must be expected to do this, because parents can't be trusted to do this properly, if at all. To quote notorious comments he made in an interview on this plane, returning from the Panama World Youth Day, he says, I believe that we must provide sex education in schools, but we need to offer an objective sexual education, as it is, without ideological colonization. Sex as a gift from God must be taught, not with rigidity. They need to have sex education. The ideal is to start from home with the parents. It's not always possible because there are so many different situations in families and because they do not know how to do it. And so the school makes up for this, because otherwise it will remain a void that will then be filled by any ideology. This is incredibly undermining whenever I do an interview with the media on behalf of Safe at School, trying to promote the idea that it's parents who should be primary educators. First thing the interview always comes back with, yeah, but parents don't do it, or they do it so badly. So if even the Pope is sowing this seed, sowing this message, then that's incredibly undermining of the role and status that parents are supposed to have. And we can see how central tenets of the comprehensive sex education agenda are really starting to take over here. The idea that children need so-called objective information on sex. Presumably that's something kind of, morally neutral, where you don't say what's right or wrong. And the state need to take over the role of parents because they can't be trusted to do it properly. And that's been mixed in with still elements of traditional Catholic teaching, where we've got this confusing mishmash. Amoris Laetitiae, chapter 7, which is titled Yes to Sex Education, or the Need for Sex Education in the English translation, is full of this quite characteristically vague but reasonable sounding language from Pope Francis, which actually says something quite unsettling. In one passage he says, for instance, moral formation should always take place with active methods and a dialogue that teaches through sensitivity and by using a language children can understand. It should also take place inductively, so that children can learn for themselves the importance of certain values, principles and norms, rather than by imposing these as absolute and unquestionable truths. Now, thinking back to my teacher training, inductive learning, basically meant that, you didn't just tell children how things worked, say in a science class or whatever. The idea was, through practical experiments, they kind of saw what happened and inferred their conclusions. They worked it out for themselves. So I can see, yes, that would work well in a science class, but what exactly does that mean in the context of sex education? Does that mean we let them just experiment and get on with it and let them work out for themselves what works, what's right or wrong? I can't see any other implication than that. And you see the sort of the way, I suppose, faithful Catholics are caricatured there. Are we not supposed to impart to our children, whether we're parents or teachers, that there are absolute and unquestionable truths? You know, what about the Ten Commandments and the law of God? So, you know, it's we're actually getting a message which is quite unsettling, confusing, and demoralising. And there's very little solid in that chapter that's anchored to reference to spiritual truths. And the Vatican's own 2016 sex education programme, the Meeting Point, which John has mentioned, it's also very much in that same vein. It lacks clarity and any clear exposition of these absolute and unquestionable truths to do with Christianity. It's very vague. It's got a very secular, New Agey feel, that the focus is on looking inside you and finding out things for yourself. And psychiatrist Rick Fitzgibbons, MD, has called this the most dangerous threat to Catholic youth that I have seen over the past 40 years. It reveals an ignorance of the enormous sexual pressure upon youth today and will result in their subsequent confusion in accepting the Church's teaching. Now, this approach of compromising our children to the comprehensive sex education agenda has been advanced for some time by the bishops of England and Wales through the Catholic Education Service, beginning with its chairmanship by then Archbishop Nichols between 1999 and 2008. And just to summarise some of the key points of concern there. So the Catholic Education Service developed a policy of partnership with a state-run confidential advice agency named Connections, allowing them to provide children in Catholic schools, including adolescents under the age of consent, information about access to abortion and contraceptive services without parental knowledge or consent. The Catholic Education Service became a signed-up member of the Sex Education Forum, which promotes positions completely contrary to Scripture and the Catholic faith. For example, it meant signing up to something called the Sex and Relationships Education Framework, which, for instance, quote, welcomes the diversity of society in the area of sexuality and regards sex education as, quote, an entitlement for all boys as well as girls, those who are heterosexual, lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and requires that children should be given, quote, relevant information which is accurate and non-judgmental about the potential consequences of unprotected sex, including abortion. Following Archbishop Nichols's chairmanship has taken over by Bishop McMahon of Nottingham, who's now Archbishop of Liverpool. In April 2010, Greg Pope, a former Labour Member of Parliament who had a very extensive anti-life, anti-family voting record, was appointed as Deputy Director of the Catholic Education Service. And Greg Pope remained in that post until his promotion in 2017 to be the Assistant General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. And we see the legacy of that really in the conduct of the Catholic Education Service in perhaps the most critical time for parents in our recent history. In March 2017, the UK Parliament passed the government's Children and Social Work Act, which went into effect in England. That made the subjects of relationships education compulsory in all primary schools in England and relationships and sex education compulsory in all secondary schools in England, including faith and independent schools. And from the outset, government spokespersons, including the Prime Minister, Theresa May herself, stated that relationships education at primary school, she was referring to it, would be LGBT inclusive. The government stated that parents would be able to withdraw their children only from the sex education parts of RSE at secondary school. That's something that was subsequently changed as well for the worse. Now, the content and delivery of relationships and sex education was subject to 2 public consultations, and the Catholic Education Service and the Bishops of England and Wales did absolutely nothing to encourage Catholics to take part in either of them. That was left to SPUC and other organisations. The draft guidance and regulations were published following the first consultation, the results of which themselves were never actually published, disclosed by the government. And even after majority opposition to them was revealed, recorded by the time of the second public consultation, the final versions of that guidance and regulations were virtually unchanged from the beginning, even though a majority of those who responded to the consultation on the proposed content were very much against what was being proposed. And those regulations were passed by a huge majority in Parliament in March 2019. Something like 600 MPs voted in favour, with only about 20 against. Now, in summary, the new statutory guidance, together with the regulations, present a completely deconstructive, secular, liberal view of human sexuality, one almost entirely divorced from scriptural truth and authentic Catholic teaching. It's the teaching that the government wants all children to have is LGBT inclusive. Their programme of study is expected to be LGBT inclusive throughout. At primary school, we're hanging on to the kind of a previous comment that it's not an absolute requirement, but as far as the government are concerned, it's strongly encouraged in primary school. That's what the government wants them to do. And we know the vast majority of primary schools will take them up on that because they want the good Ofsted rating. So homosexual relationships and disordered family structures are, of course, to be presented in an entirely positive manner. Teenagers, particularly at secondary school, are encouraged to explore their developing sexual orientation and gender identity. Real marriage between man and woman is completely sidelined. It's officially redefined to include same-sex marriage and on the same par with civil partnerships. Marriage is simply presented as one possible relationship option. The emphasis is on the diversity of different, quote, healthy relationships and family structures. It promotes abortion and facilitates underage sex. Secondary school children are to be provided with comprehensive so-called non-judgmental information on contraception and abortion. They are to be signposted as to where and how to obtain abortion and contraceptive services without parental knowledge or consent. Carrying an unborn child to term is presented simply as one of the possible options when pregnant, which children have to explore. Through all this, parents are sidelined. So the role of the school, teachers and the state has been greatly expanded into areas up to now considered the rightful and natural territory of parental responsibility. The new compulsory subjects, including health education, attempt to cover virtually every single aspect of the child's moral formation, health and well-being. So this is something that will further undermine and discourage good, conscientious parenting. And above all, parents have lost their right of withdrawal from these subjects. Parents now have no legal right to withdraw their children, even from the sex education parts at secondary school, as the government first proposed. The parental right to withdrawal has been replaced by a right to request withdrawal. And in an affront to parents, the final decision on whether you can withdraw your child or not has been given to the head teacher. Now, rather than making any kind of stand for parental rights, Archbishop Malcolm McMahon, who was then chair of the CES, and Paul Barber, its director thereafter, issued a series of statements from the outset welcoming the government's, quote, commitment to improving relationships and sex education in all schools. And they boasted how our Catholic schools already deliver high quality, age-appropriate RSE from nursery all the way through to sixth form. Even after the regulations had been changed, before the bill was passed in Parliament, to remove even the partial right of withdrawal parents still had, the CES still welcomed the changes that the government was making and actually misleadingly kept claiming the right of parental withdrawal had been maintained, which it hadn't done. In one of Archbishop McMahon's statements, he notes that, quote, it is essential that parents fully support the school's approach to these sensitive matters. So just contrast that with the strong statements that we heard quoted earlier from John. So aside from the complete disregard for the welfare and the eternal souls of the 95% of children who don't go to a Catholic school, what exactly is this high quality, age-appropriate relationships and sex education that the Catholic Education Service is offering to its schools? Well, for a start, they welcomed and will now have to deliver in their schools the government's new statutory RSE regulations. And I've just summarised a moment ago the ways in which they're completely incompatible with authentic Catholic teaching. The CES has its own model policy for RSE, which it keeps boasting has been praised by the Department for Education. Now, this will soon, no doubt, be updated and published to take into account the new statutory regulations. But even the current model policy for RSE from 2000 features a very uncomfortable mix of Catholic teaching with elements of the last statutory SRE guidance, again dating from 2000. It's traditional Catholic teaching with lots of elements of the contemporary secular sex education programs and agenda shoehorned into it. So, for instance, at Key Stage 1, that's ages 5 to 7, children are taught, for instance, how to, quote, identify and correctly name their private parts. At Key Stage 2, that's ages 7 to 11, they're taught that, quote, the similarities and differences between people arise from different factors. See Protected Characteristics of the Equality Act 2010, Parts 2, Chapter 1, Sections 4 to 12, which, to summarise that, in other words, they're taught about, quote, sexual orientation and gender reassignment. This is ages 7 to 11. And numerous other ambiguous elements of the policy, at the very least, allow scope for teaching that's not at all in accordance with the faith. So, for instance, the secondary school CSE policy stipulates teaching children about, quote, recognising and valuing their own sexual identity and that of others. And to ensure RSE is sensitive to the different needs of individual pupils in respect to their own sexual orientation. So we know what all that means. So it's elements like that, even the official model RSE policy, that the CES, that can be seen to have facilitated, for instance, the scandal of homosexual lobby group Stonewall being invited into Catholic schools and colleges to train teachers on how to deal with so-called homophobic bullying. And the CES has even produced its own range of pro-LGBT propaganda. It's published at least 2 heretical documents promoting the moral acceptability of homosexuality. The first, which John mentioned, Learning to Love, 2017. This is an RSE guide for Catholic educators. In the foreword, it declares its admiration for Amoris Laetitia as a, quote, inspirational document rich with insights and fresh descriptions on the Church's teaching on this vital subject. Now, on the subject of homosexuality, Learning to Love offers its own fresh description of the Church's teaching. It refers to same-sex relationships as being able to constitute a, quote, powerful and an exalted form of love equal to that of man and woman, husband and wife. And it applauds, this is a quote, it applauds the great progress that has been made in countering all forms of discrimination against homosexuality in recent times. And we wish to collaborate with efforts to make such discrimination obsolete. So note that, as I tried to stress there, we're talking about discrimination against homosexuality as something that should be countered, as opposed to unjust discrimination against homosexual persons, as the Catechism states. So homosexuality itself has now been transformed from, quote, an inclination which is objectively disordered, as the Catechism states, to what can now be a, quote, exalted form of love, as Learning to Love states. And what does it actually mean to collaborate with efforts to make such discrimination obsolete? Does it mean to actively promote the LGBT and pride agendas? Does it mean to shut down freedom of speech on the issue and persecute Christians and others who are trying to speak the truth about homosexuality? The second, and probably even more pernicious document is this, Made in God's Image, subtitled Challenging Homophobic and Biphobic Bullying in Catholic Schools. This has been published in two editions. First edition 2017, this is the 2018 edition, which has got, which is virtually unchanged really from the first one. This is a joint publication of the CES with St Mary's University, Twickenham. This presents itself as guidance for the pastoral care of pupils. But it's really designed to intimidate Catholic schools into introducing a concerted LGBT indoctrination programme for secondary school children in the form of an 8th lesson scheme of work. And really the sum of the message, and I think it's still available on the Catholic Education Service website, so you can download it and have a look through it yourself. But the sum of the message really that children are to take away from all this is that being lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender is part of their God-given purpose and identity. It's an integral part of being made in God's image, something that must be celebrated, and that any true Catholic should act to report and help robustly stamp out any signs of disapproval. Now, as has been widely pointed out on a number of Catholic blogs, much of the content here has been copied and pasted from other documents from Stonewall and LGBT Youth Scotland. And it has, except that it's got many items of misleadingly selective quotations from Catholic teaching and scripture shoehorned in. An example from the introduction illustrates the strategy that's been taken here. Quote, the Church teaches that homosexual persons, quote, must be accepted with respect, compassion and sensitivity. It's quoting from the Catholic Catechism. The school should be mindful that the Church teaches that homosexual inclinations are not sinful. For older pupils who may publicly identify themselves as such, church schools should be havens of respect and custodians of the true dignity of each human being. They should be as attentive to the possibility of homosexual pupils being marginalised and bullied as they are to discrimination based on religion, gender, race, or disability. So the thing is, nothing is provided here to qualify at all these statements, such as pointed out that the Catechism, which it quotes from, also adds that the inclination itself is objectively disordered and that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. Quote, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity. There's no mention whatsoever in this document of any Catholic doctrine on marriage or any attempt to present the true meaning and purpose of human sexuality between man and woman. Indeed, the only thing that's presented as sinful, although it never directly employs the term sin, is the apparent new sin of homophobia, which, quote, should have no place among Catholics. Catholic teaching on homosexuality is not founded on and can never be used to justify homophobic attitudes. Now, in one of the word games that children are encouraged to play, homophobia is defined as, quote, a range of negative attitudes and feelings towards homosexuality or people who are identified as being lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender, LGBT. It can be expressed as antipathy, contempt, prejudice, aversion, or hatred, may be based on a rational fear, and is sometimes related to religious beliefs. So children are essentially being instructed by the Catholic Education Service that if they experience negative emotions, even about homosexuality, if they have an aversion to the idea of homosexuality, including homosexual behaviour or presumably homosexual advances, then there's something wrong with them. They have an irrational fear, which is it's implied, is sinful. So, of course, this is corruption of children. This is grooming. It even encourages children to judge and challenge their own parents' and families' attitudes based on provided examples of homophobia and clearly labelling such attitudes as bigoted. Certain of our bishops, however, see it differently. Bishop Patrick McKinney of Nottingham, one of the 6 English bishops who celebrates or endorses LGBT masses in his diocese, well, I'll come back to that shortly. He stated in a letter to one of our supporters, quote, "The second edition has been approved," meaning by the bishops of England and Wales, "as a document produced by the Catholic Education Service," this is the second edition. "It is intended to offer pastoral support of children in our Catholic schools who may be experiencing bullying of this kind. Such bullying or bullying of any kind cannot be tolerated in our schools. This document," he says, "does not promote homosexuality." Well, we've just had a quote from it which clearly shows that, in fact, it does. Now, anti-bullying and equality programs are one of the main ways that the LGBT ideology has been promoted across the whole school curricula, outside the boundaries even of relationships education, increasingly now at virtually every primary school. The programme No Outsiders is one of the most notorious examples of LGBT indoctrination at primary schools. It was written by homosexual activist teacher Andrew Moffat, MBE, currently assistant head teacher at Parkfield Primary School in Birmingham. He had previously produced another notorious indoctrination programme for primary schools called CHIPS, Challenging Homophobia in Primary Schools, which was adopted in schools run by Birmingham City Council. And subsequently, Andrew Moffat was awarded an MBE for his services to equality. Now, No Outsiders aims to strategically deconstruct the child's awareness of themselves as a girl or boy, and presents a completely disordered view of the family and aims to completely normalise relationships based on homosexuality, cohabitation, and every other kind of sexual sin from the earliest age. Parents at Parkfield Primary School and Anderton Park Primary Schools in Birmingham, predominantly Muslim parents, were left with no option but to withdraw their children and protest outside the school gates after the school and the local education authority had refused to respond to their concerns. They were the concerns of the vast majority of parents there, and they refused to withdraw the programme. Following a High Court judgment last week, a censorship zone has now been enforced around both schools, and their acts of witness in defence of their children will no longer be allowed. So they and other parents there are at the end of the road, and several, in fact, are now facing legal battles of their own for withdrawing their children. The Muslim parents there, not unreasonably, have looked to the different Christian communities and denominations, including the Catholic Church, for support. But where exactly does church leadership stand on No Outsiders and similar programmes? Well, a recent church militant investigation following tip-offs from concerned parents found that at least 10 Catholic primary schools in the Liverpool Archdiocese alone are using No Outsiders. Now, in an education newsletter from summer 2019, which was sent to all schools by the Liverpool Archdiocese for evangelisation, LACE, that provides an RSE update, which states, and I quote, "In response to the government's new document about their statutory requirements for RSE to be taught, nothing needs to change in our schools as we are doing everything it asks. In fact, the CES materials are referenced in the document. If local authorities have sent guidance for RSE that you are considering in school, please send a copy into our team at LACE to ensure it meets with church teaching and bishops' requirements. All That I Am can be used to supplement Journey in Love in years 5 and 6. Exemplars of curriculum planning can be shared if needed. However, you still need to cover all primary years. Information on No Outsiders is still current and fine to use in school. Given the current climate, it might be better not to post on social media and use the term. Instead, use the term all are welcome instead of No Outsiders for the time being to avoid adverse publicity. So schools in the Liverpool Archdiocese are hoodwinking parents by using All That I Am and Journey in Love. They're not perfect at all, but they're RSE programmes commonly used in primary schools. They're using that in the RSE lessons, but they're using No Outsiders separately to teach equality. Moreover, the Archdiocese is instructing schools to refer to No Outsiders as all are welcome in order to deliberately mislead parents about what exactly is being taught. Now, it's not clear at this stage how many other Catholic schools in other dioceses are using this or similar LGBT programmes. But the fact is that as appalling as No Outsiders is, it's actually quite in tune with what certain of our bishops purport to be Catholic teaching and the pro-LGBT agenda which they are pursuing in their own diocese. A recent report on LifeSite News by Paul Smeaton showed how the LGBT agenda is spreading like contagion through Catholic dioceses in England, with at least 6 bishops now celebrating or endorsing LGBT pride masses in their diocese, mostly with the active collaboration with a group called Quest. That's an LGBT group whose stated aim on its website is to effect a change in Catholic teaching on gender and sexuality. The bishops in question are Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster, as well as celebrating Pride Masses himself. He's supported the group LGBT Catholic Westminster, including supporting their participation in the London Pride March. There's Bishop Patrick McKinney of Nottingham. He's celebrated and endorses a regular LGBT masses in his diocese, and as also, as we'd heard, has endorsed Made in God's Image. Bishop Terence Drainey of Middlesbrough. There's an LGBTQ plus ministry actively promoted on his diocesan website, and they've hosted a monthly LGBT mass since 2017. He's also, by the way, on the management committee of the Catholic Education Service. Bishop Peter Doyle of Northampton, he attended a Quest conference last year and has publicly suggested on Vatican Radio that via future synods, Catholic teaching will eventually change to accept homosexual relationships. So naturally, this gives him the credentials to also be chair of the Bishops' Committee for Marriage and Family Life and a member of the Department of Education and Formation. Bishop Declan Lang of Clifton Diocese, he has met with Quest and subsequently requested a whole series of LGBT plus masses organised by them and actively promoted on his diocesan website. And the most recent addition to the fold, Bishop John Arnold of Salford, he recently celebrated his diocese's first LGBT Mass organised in conjunction with Quest. He went on to Radio 4's Sunday morning programme to publicise the Mass, and during that interview he publicly belittled and dismissed the small number of faithful Catholics who had complained to him about it. The LGBT agenda is insidiously working its way through the church, often in subtle but actually quite devastating ways. In the area of safeguarding for children and vulnerable adults, for example, all clergy, religious, lay ministers, church staff and volunteers, anyone, in fact, in a role requiring a DBS or other safeguarding procedure is being asked by their diocesan safeguarding leaders to sign what is, in fact, an heretical code of conduct issued by the National Catholic Safeguarding Commission, the NCSC, as a condition of continuing in their roles. And this contains two clauses which are incompatible with scripture and authentic Catholic teaching. In the section promote autonomy and dignity, we are all asked, if we're going to be in a role that requires safeguarding procedure, to pledge that we will, quote, constructively challenge all discrimination and encourage children and young people to not discriminate on the grounds of age, gender, ability, social class, race, cultural background, religious beliefs, or sexual identity. So you might say, of course, well, discrimination is bad, but it's not qualified at all. So, what does it mean to not discriminate against someone because of their professed sexual identity, in a Catholic context? Sexual identity, of course, is a term very much informed by LGBT ideology. So, in effect, are we meant to actively indoctrinate young people into complete endorsement and acceptance of those propagating what are mortally sinful lifestyles? The following statement from the Code of Conduct is equally problematic. We are to respect, promote and support the right of children and young people to make their own choices and decisions, provided this does not threaten the rights, safety and legitimate interests of others. Well, you might say, well, that sounds okay, but what's missing there? And the fact is there's no reference at all to parents. And we should be first and foremost encouraging our children and young people in church to honour and obey their parents in the Lord, as that is a commandment of God. So again, this appears to be informed more by LGBT ideology and the secular notion of children's rights, which are in fact children's sexual rights agenda, an agenda which is doing so much to undermine parents as well as putting our children and young people at risk of harm and sexual exploitation. So this is what every single priest, deacon, religious, Eucharistic minister, staff or volunteer in any role requiring a DBS check has signed up to, at least in my diocese. I had been asked to be a safeguarding representative by my parish priest, a role which I happily agreed to and took up to do something for my parish. When the code of conduct was issued, I refused to sign it or ask anyone else to, because I saw clearly it was problematic. My parish priest asked me to take my concerns to the diocesan safeguarding director, where I was bluntly told that the code of conduct had been endorsed by the bishops. It was based on sound safeguarding principles, and that I was the only one in the country who had complained. And I was, of course, immediately removed from my post. Been talking mostly about the situation in England. Scottish bishops have in fact gone the furthest so far and welcomed an LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum in all Scottish schools, including, of course, their Catholic schools. What about the situation in Wales? Well, the Welsh government recently announced that it was introducing compulsory relationships and sexuality education in all Welsh schools in 2022. And it's also recently announced its intention to remove the parents' right of withdrawal. They've just recently had another consultation on that, which Safe at School had a campaign on, which closed last week. They had another consultation because the first consultation early in the year, 87% of respondents wanted to retain the parents' right of withdrawal. So, of course, they wanted another consultation to get a different result. So that's what the Welsh government has proposed in Wales, and because we've had a lot of bad news there, I want to actually end on quite a bizarrely positive note, because quite out of character, the Catholic Education Service has introduced a small campaign opposing those moves by the Welsh government. They've actually encouraged Catholics to write to register their disapproval with their assembly member. On their website, the page says, "Please add your voice to help stop the Welsh government from removing the rights of parents as the first educators of their children." Now, I think they perhaps should have done more, like encourage Catholics to also take part in the consultation, but compared to what we had before from the Catholic Education Service, there's, a very significant change there in the right direction. The new chair of the Catholic Education Service, the Right Reverend Marcus Stock, issued a statement for the general election, urging Catholics to challenge their election candidates on a range of issues relating to Catholic schools, including RSE. And the statement contains this passage: "Relationships and sex education in Catholic education is based on the formation of the whole child. Well-taught and age-appropriate relationships and sex education, RSE, is an important part of this. However, even more important is the right of parents as the primary educators of their children to be fully consulted and to maintain their ability to withdraw their children from these lessons. While we are confident that the model curriculum in Catholic schools delivers RSE in accordance with the teachings of the Church and the wishes of parents, the same cannot be said for other schools. Hence, for Catholic parents who do not have the option to send their child to a Catholic school, it is vital that this parental right remains in place." Now, of course, again, it's not perfect as a statement, and it's a couple of years too late for us in England, but what a striking contrast to what we've had up to now from Archbishop McMahon and the Catholic Education Service. So maybe, just maybe, we're already starting to see the answer to our prayers that we're all making to God this weekend.